Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for my final thoughts, well mine and Oscar's final thoughts on L2's Grand Fleet, which I've just demonstrated probably not all that well in the last two videos. Generally speaking, I do like this game. As I've said before, it tackles the very tricky subject of dealing with the First World War in the North Sea and Northern European waters rather well. In his designer's notes at the end, Steve Newberg says that it's not meant to be a hyper-realistic war game and that what he's trying to do using the sort of quick playing war at sea system, coupled with the strategic model he's built around it, is to give players really broad brush impressions of the considerations that vexed commanders on both sides of the First World War in Northern Europe, or at least the naval side thereof. And largely, I think he succeeds. Going through the difficulty of trying to play both sides in what should be a fog of war heavy game, it nonetheless gave me a chance to really try and crawl into the heads of people like Jellicoe and Scheer and their respective naval high commands. So for the British, you've got loads of ships, you have loads and loads of ships, and more arrive over the course of play. This is the very encouraging thing. You receive a steady trickle of reinforcements. And then, the United States weighs in as well. You have your other erstwhile allies. You've got Tsarist Russia, which may or may not make an appearance from turn to turn. But even if they don't, they force the Germans to keep significant forces in the Baltic just in case. And then when the Yanks show up, things are even better. If you're into the optional rules, you can even add in the French to make your position in the Channel even more secure. So numbers of ships are not a problem if you stick them all in the same place, but therein lies your problem. I won't do what I did previously and try waving the entire map around, but this really nice reprint on the back of the box helps illustrate my point. In order to get anywhere in terms of victory points through area control, the British need to make maximum use of the ships they've got. And they need to be aware that the Germans are always hovering, waiting to take advantage of any strategic mistakes they make. You'll soon find, I think, as the British player, that you simply do not have enough ships to comprehensively cover as much sea as you want. And you have difficult questions about how to use things like your considerable force of pre-dreadnoughts. Now, on their own, they're very weak and easily stomped on. But the problem is, if you group them into imposing forces guarding the Channel, as I did during that demonstration, you're using almost 20 ships just to secure zones that are worth only one victory point to you each turn. The alternate strategy for the British is once they've secured, if they secure control of all these sea areas and generally keep the Germans bottled up, then maybe they can afford to break the pre-dreadnought fleets up into penny packets, because if they send them out as independent forces, they only really need to send 2 per sea zone at a minimum to try and snap up all the low-hanging fruit, as it were. The Germans have very different sets of considerations. Now, of course, most of the victory point areas are worth more to them, which makes a lot of sense. But they can't simply hunker down and just make sure their coastal areas are all right, because if you restrict yourself to doing that, even if you're very aggressive with the anti-mercantile submarine warfare, as I tried to be on their behalf during the demo game, you're probably not going to get as far ahead in victory points as you would like. Now, you can probably try that for a while and then count on maybe inflicting a stinging defeat on the British later, but it's a bit of a risky strategy. And as I'd said earlier, from the British perspective, you have to be a bit careful because the British are always being reinforced. In fact, the best opportunity the Germans have is really early in the game. Aside from that, keep trying to dominate the Baltic and the the inner Scandinavian seas, because there's a rich harvest of victory points to be had there. There's not really all that much that the British can do to you unless the Russians do something. I mean, I sometimes suspect that having victory points for the British in these areas, much as having victory points for the Germans on the Atlantic side of the British Isles, is really just there to torment the other player. Because realistically, unless something goes hideously wrong for the other side, it's not really going to happen. So I think the game captures the strategy very, very well. It's a wonderful system that doesn't overburden the players. And of course, Fog of War, unlike most of the other games in the War at Sea stable, this game makes very, very good use of Fog of War. And playing against a live opponent, you sometimes have visual clues because fleets have to be stacked or grouped with their component battle group counters. So if you see a big wodge of counters moving into the same area, chances are it's a battle group or a fleet, but it may still be a deception. Um, so yes, this game can be full of nasty surprises, and you do end up trying to read your opponent's mind quite a bit. Um, in terms of the way it handles big sea actions and other types of maritime warfare, it's a bit of a curious hybrid, because there are some details as to how you conduct mine warfare. If you play with the optional rules, submarines are more than just a reconnaissance tool and an anti-commerce weapon. They can actually be positioned off enemy ports to snipe them as they return to harbour. That's quite a nice touch, and both sides did historically follow those strategies during the First World War. I do like the tactical rules regarding reconnaissance and screening, because although they can be a bit fiddly, they're not quite like any other rule set in the War at Sea group. And although players of more detailed naval games might find a lot to recognize, they're a bit of a halfway house between very detailed and very light. But I think they work well, because for me, what they illustrate is the huge difficulty involved in bringing two sides to battle if one of the participants does not want to play. And if it's the participant that has stronger reconnaissance forces, then you may outgun them as much as you like, but they'll have enough warning to break away and split for home. And yes, it does mean they're abandoning a valuable sea zone. Yes, Oscar, I know. It does mean they're abandoning a valuable sea zone, but then they're preserving their fleet for a possible future action. So I like that element to it. What other good stuff can I say about this game? I think that's really about it. I've covered, I mean, not to say that I've run out of good things to say already. The combat system is what you would expect. I'll just say a few words about that. It's classic War at Sea. You roll your dice. A 6 is a damaging hit, and you roll again to see how many hits you inflict. A 5 is the signature disabled result, which allows a damaged ship to sprout wings and immediately flee to port. There's been so much said about whether people like or dislike that about the War at Sea system. It is what it is. I like that it guarantees a few survivors from a battle rather than this, fight to the death that you would otherwise get. I think if I've got any criticism, it is to do with the details. And when you're creating a game like this, the devil is very often in the detail. And those details relate to very specific elements of the fleets of both sides, really. So, being an airship nut, I am very pleased that airships, yay, play a part in this game. I am very puzzled to find airships in the Royal Navy's order of battle around what would be the spring of 1915, because I know that the British were beginning to make strides with, kite balloons, balloon ships, and blimps. But the two squadrons of airships they begin the game with have the same range and capability as the German Zeppelins, the big rigid airships. And this does make me raise an eyebrow, because my question is, who are these people, and what are these things? Because of course the British lost the Mayfly in 1911, a few years before the war started. That was their first attempt at a big rigid. And they were finally successful with a homegrown unit. I say successful, they got her into the sky, but she wasn't capable of doing very much. His Majesty's Airship Number 9, which was very useful as a test bed and a start to future construction. But she didn't successfully do sustained flights until November 1916. So I can only assume these guys are there to represent other kinds of aerial forces. Again, I'd love to know who, possibly the seaplane carriers and similar, because they do not have their own dedicated units in this game. So the familiar faces of Engadine, Vindex, all the converted Isle of Man steamers that ended up sporting canvas hangars and planes, they're not there. So I guess these fellows represent that capability. The other thing that makes me raise an eyebrow a bit is some of the ship ratings. Now, there's that wonderful, wonderful, and very tired trope, which still does the rounds today, of, Royal Naval vessel in the First World War, very likely to go bang at the slightest provocation, whereas their German opposite numbers were virtually unsinkable. And like all good tired tropes, it based on some kernels of truth, but it's been really overblown, and it's one that I tend to push back against. Now, why am I disappearing down this rabbit hole? It's just because there are a couple of things here that make me raise an eyebrow just a little bit. I would say the most glaring one, because some of these, you can debate them back and forth, and that's fair enough. But the one that really startles me is that one. So that the Deutschlands, the really Germany's best and latest pre-dreadnought battleships, when the war rolled round, they have a rating of 243. Now, those ratings put them on a level with a number of dreadnoughts. In fact, if I bring the box really close, you can see that in terms of their protection, they are as good as the battlecruiser Hindenburg in terms of their survivability. And also, they have the same level of survivability as the British Queen Elizabeth class battleships. So that makes me sit back in my chair a bit and go, really? By way of comparison, most British pre-dreadnoughts at best have a survivability rating of 2. So, I mean, that's the most glaringly odd thing I've spotted in this game. And it may be a misprint, for all I know. I might have missed an errata there somewhere that says, Pommern and her sisters should actually have a survivability rating of 2. I might have to double check that. But there are just these little things here and there that I think they either sell some of the ships short, particularly on the British side, where the dreadnought Agincourt has a ridiculously weak rating. Now, her armor, we know now, her protection scheme was suboptimal, partly because of the crazy number of turrets she had. 7 turrets is impressive, but a nightmare to protect. But she's given a weaker defensive rating than HMS Dreadnought, which I think, given everything the British had learned between Dreadnought and Agincourt, is a tiny bit unfair. Some of the German ships, their stats are a little bit too close. There's not that much difference between the Helgoland class and their predecessors. And you just think, well, okay, they weren't the best dreadnoughts the Germans built, but they weren't that horrible either. Now, all of that said, this is not a detail game, so I'll always come back to that. This is a grand strategy war game. And I think it's easy to sort of come down a bit too hard on the designer in terms of what he's trying to achieve. And it must be said, what he has succeeded in achieving in this game, which is to give us a really fun, really engaging naval war game. And as he himself says, if there's something it doesn't strike you as being quite right, then house rule it. There's a talking about the victory point values on the map, the ones that are rather inaccessible to both sides. He actually says, work out a house rule if you want to make more use of those. So I quite like that encouragement to creative thinking. It's not that we've been served up with a partially finished game and told, oh, finish it yourself. No, he's presented us with a very enjoyable, and I do enjoy this game, a very enjoyable simulation of the First World War in Northern Waters, um, but also added this very delightful encouragement to do something else with it if we want to. So I don't know. Maybe I might put my money where my mouth is at some point and try, working up alternate counters for some of these ships. Just another thing to be aware of before I leave the vessels represented behind. In a number of cases, when it comes to the vessels that are not actually dreadnoughts or battle cruisers, the counters represent more than one vessel. And some of the names are applied to be fairly generic. So, for example, there is only one of the two British Lord Nelson class pre-dreadnoughts, because I think that one counter is meant to represent both ships. Now, this is not always consistent. It's not a straight one counter represents two. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But I think at its heart, and what also might be behind some of the ratings, is a desire to create a game system where both sides have an equal chance of winning. So if the British have been pared back a bit in terms of raw gunpowder and the Germans have been hyped a bit in terms of survivability, I think that is partly the thinking behind this. Really, I should get off my backside and see if I can have a conversation with Steve Newberg about this. He did correspond with me about this game several years ago, and he was really nice about it. The context was I had asked him if I could I could take it to a sort of show and tell at a museum, um, for an evening that was about the development of wargaming from Jane's to the present day. And he sent me a lovely message saying, yes, please do take my game and show it to people. So I really appreciated that at the time. And yeah, I might see if I can engage him in a conversation, but that's a matter for another time. I think really just to say that aside from physical peculiarities, like the map could have been. One of you have already commented, made the observation the map could be slightly better cardstock. I mean, graphically, it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite maps from war games dealing with this subject. The counters are nice, they're decently sized, they're good quality, they're well printed. It's that dice. And I know I started something when I mentioned it in my first video. Um, in a dice heavy game like War at Sea, the fact that this came with a single dice in the box amused me, and I also have to tip my hat to the sheer optimism behind that one dice is going to see a heck of a lot of use. um, but that aside, yeah, as I've already said, I think this is a really fun and engaging game. I think if you have any interest at all in this period of naval history, or indeed in the First World War, it is a wonderful game to get. Um, if Mr. Bomber will forgive me the comparison, I've played both games, and between this and Nine Navies War, I think this game actually does a somewhat better job. Now, I don't want to sell Nine Navies War short, because this game doesn't have a Mediterranean element, for example, so it's somewhat narrower in its scope. But in terms of how the system works, I think this nails it. And with the plethora of optional rules to make it even more interesting, there is so much replayability in this box. So I would say, despite a few things that make me twitch slightly or push my ship geek buttons, this is a really excellent treatment, and I would highly recommend it. as I often say when it comes to games I enjoy, if you can get yourself a copy, I know this game's become a bit hard to find now, definitely worth doing, or track down someone who owns a copy. Hello. And if you're within easy gaming range of each other, then do give it a try. If any of your friends who've got this, I do recommend it. One of the great optional rules that's been created for it is that you can even turn it into a 4-player game if you want to experience all the fun of divided command. But I will leave that there. Yes, to all of you who've watched this series, thank you so much for your time and engagement. I really appreciate all the comments I've received so far. And as of this recording, I've replied to some of you, and I will get round to the others as soon as I can. But thank you guys so much, as always. That's both my eternally patient and long-suffering veterans and anyone who may have recently joined the channel. Thank you guys so much. It's really wonderful to have you aboard, and whoever you are and wherever you might be watching from, thank you so much again. Do take care, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.